Arizona is recognized. Could I please have order in the chamber, please? The senator from Arizona is recognized.
Madam President, is my understanding we're now on the fiscal year 2010 Consolidated Appropriations Act.
Senator, the Senate is in a quorum call.
Ask unanimous consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Madam President, I'll have a lot to say about this 3,000-page omnibus appropriations bill, but I would point out to my colleagues that it's loaded down with 4,752 earmarks totaling $3.7 billion. 6 bills totaling $450 billion, 351 pages long, 409 pages of earmarks. Spending on domestic programs is increased by 14%. Veteran spending is increased by 5%. That shows the priorities around here. Let me repeat that. Domestic spending programs is increased by 14%. Military construction and veterans is increased by only 5%. Here we go again. Just a matter of months ago in March, the Senate passed a monstrous $410 billion, 3,000-page omnibus appropriations bill that was loaded up with over 9,000 earmarks. At that time, those of us who complained said about the ridiculous amount of waste were ignored. In fact, the President's director of the Office of Management and Budget, Peter Orszag, said in an interview, quote, "This is last year's business. We want to just move on." Truly remarkable statement coming from the man the President put in charge of the government's budget. In March, the Majority Leader placed the blame for the omnibus spending bill at the feet of President Bush. Senator Reid said, quote, "We have a lot of issues we need to get to after we fund the government, something we should have done last year, but could not because of the difficulty we had working with President Bush." So what's the excuse this time? Where will the blame be placed now? Is the Majority Leader having difficulty working with President Obama? We've had all year to work on 12 annuals, and we only enacted 5 of them through the regular order, and one of those 5 was passed and sent to the President before the new fiscal year began. We should be embarrassed by this process. Here we go again. Faced with a whopping 1,350-page omnibus appropriations conference report, which contains 6 bills, spends $450 billion, and 4,752 earmarks, totaling $3.7 billion. Meanwhile, people are out of jobs, they're out of their homes. Unemployment in my home state is 17%, and we're going to spend money on things like $2,700,000. Get this, I'm not making it up. $2,700,000 for supporting surgical operations in outer space. Supporting surgical operations in outer space at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, Omaha, Nebraska. $30,000 for Woodstock Film Festival Youth Initiative. $13.9 million for fisheries in Hawaii. The list goes on and on and on and on. $200,000 to renovate and construct the Laredo Little Theater. American taxpayers shouldn't be spending our dollars to be replacing worn auditorium seating and soundproofing materials. The list goes on and on and on. $800,000 for jazz at the Lincoln Center. $3.4 million for a rural bus program in Hawaii. You'll note that Hawaii pops up all the time here. $1.6 million to build a tram between the Huntsville Botanical Garden and the Marshall Flight Center in Alabama. $750,000 for the design and fabrication of exhibits to be placed in the World Food Prize Hall of Laureates in Iowa. I'm not making these up. I'm not making these up. And this was the same party and president that promised to scrub each one of these appropriations bills and get rid of the unnecessary ones. So we'll be talking a lot about this bill. But I want to point out again what's before us to the American people. 6 bills, not one, 6 bills totaling $450 billion, 409 pages of earmarks, 4,752 earmarks, totaling $3.7 billion. And spending on domestic programs is increased by 14%. Mccain and veteran spending is increased by 5%. Now, I've just met recently with the governor of my state. We are suffering under incredible economic difficulties. They're having the greatest financial crisis in the history of my state. Couldn't they use some of this $3.7 billion in earmarks to pay for some of the essential services that they're having to be cut back, not only in my state, all over America? No, the beat goes on. It's business as usual here in Washington, and do not be surprised at the anger of the American people over this way of doing business. Bills of 1,351 pages long, filled with earmarks and pork that is got nothing to do with the betterment of our nation. So we'll be talking a lot more about many of these pork barrel amendments that are on, but it's really awful. $200,000 for design and construction of the Garapan Public Market in the northern Marianas Islands. We'll be hearing a lot more about it. I yield the floor.
Senator, yield for a question.
I'll be glad to.
The senator mentioned that these 7 bills, year-over-year increase in spending is 12%. Does the senator from Arizona know what the CPI this last year was for?
The CPI was minus 1.3%, not to mention 10% unemployment in America, not to mention people not being able to stay in their homes, not to mention the hardest economic conditions in history. And by the way, or certainly since the Great Depression, spending on domestic programs is increased by 14%. What brings that down to 12% is that they only increased veteran spending by 5%. But opera houses, rural bus programs, music programs, $300,000 for music programs at Carnegie Hall. You know, do you really think that Carnegie Hall needs $300,000 for music programs?
Does the senator yield for another question? Does any of these numbers that you're talking to, this 12% increase in spending in these 7 appropriation bills over the previous year, at a time when families across this country are being asked to tighten their belts, small businesses are tightening their belts, as you said, we've got record unemployment. Do these numbers include the almost $1 trillion that was spent earlier this year in the stimulus bill?
Stimulus bill has nothing to do with that, I would say to my colleague, and we all know that. This is an entirely new 6 appropriations bills totaling nearly $450 billion, which, by the way, the majority leader wanted to pass by unanimous consent. Remarkable.
Well, I'd say to my colleague and friend from Arizona that 12% year-over-year increase, and some of the 5 bills that have already passed had increases that were in the teens in terms of the year-over-year increases too. I don't know how, when you pass a $1 trillion stimulus bill, much of which was distributed to federal agencies that are also going to get these year-over-year 12%, 14, 15% increases in spending, how we can justify that to the American taxpayer or to hardworking Americans who are struggling right now to make ends meet and having to balance their family budgets. States are struggling to balance their budgets, but here in Washington, it seems like it's just spend, spend, spend.
And I'd also respond to my friend, it has to be in the context of a revision over 10 years recently by the Office of Management Budget from $10 to $12 trillion deficit. And the deficit for this year is $1.4 trillion. And I'm not sure what it is next year, but they couldn't have known that in the Appropriations Committee when they pass spending measures such as this. The point is, in the face of massive, unprecedented deficits, unfunded liabilities in Social Security and Medicare, where we're asking Americans all over to tighten their belts. In my state, essential services are being cut because they don't have enough money. This is the same business as usual that we've seen for years. And so I saw a poll yesterday, it was in Hotline or one of those, that the approval rating of members of Congress is below that of used car salesmen. I just have not met those who express their approval. So we should not be surprised at some very interesting things that may take place in the elections coming up this November. But it's really unfortunate, that's all.
Senator, the one final point I'd make is, of all that spending that you mentioned, and again, that the $1 trillion in stimulus money was all borrowed money. That was all added to the debt, will be added to the debt, going to be paid for by our children and grandchildren. The $1.4 trillion